Donovan. I'm fellow for Chinese Society and Political Economy at the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. I'd like to welcome all of you to Asia Society headquarters and thank you for coming to our panel today on U.S.-China relations and the future of innovation. What is the cost to global science? Now, 100 years ago, China's contributions to global science were not recognized, let alone acknowledged. Starting in the 1950s, a biochemist at Cambridge, Joseph Needham, began a monumental project that would challenge the Western-centric view of scientific history. His monumental multi-volume work, Science and Civilization in China, showed how China had in fact played a major role in influencing the development of science in the West. Now today, there's no question that scientists, researchers, and entrepreneurs in China are making significant advances in science and technology. Nonetheless, there's an increasing risk that their ability to take part in the global circulation of knowledge and information will once again be blocked by political prejudices and cultural arrogance, as happened during the Cold War. At the Center for China Analysis, our work is grounded in the belief that a thorough and nuanced understanding of what is happening in China is essential for the future. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's panel on the future of innovation, Jennifer Chu, who is our Director of Research and Strategy. Jennifer?
Great. Thank you, GA. Is this on? Yeah. So I see here before me on an early morning on a Friday, and actually Friday before Memorial Day weekend, you have all showed up. And so I know we have a dedicated audience here interested in China and U.S.-China relations and what the implications might be for the rest of the world. So thank you for coming here today. We have a stellar panel here to talk to us about how the two scientific powerhouses in the world has been a close collaborator in science and technology up to now, but that relationship is fraying. And on top of that, the policies that the U.S. government has started to impose on universities and also on science research within our country that might also be impacting that relationship. So you may know or not know that co-authored science papers between U.S. and China has been the highest among any country pairs in the world until about 2017. But as we all know, geopolitical tensions, national security concerns, and political pressures in both countries have started to narrow that space for collaboration. But that bilateral collaboration wasn't just good for our two countries. It actually generated and produced global scientific goods. That era might be slipping away, however. And so we want to understand what has been happening over time due to these security concerns and due to these national security concerns and geopolitical competition. Where are we today and where are we heading forward? In China, domestically, we have seen policies that emphasize self-sufficiency in terms of technological innovation. In the US, we have also made a significant policy pivot towards export controls, visa restrictions, and also investigations like the China Initiative. But Beijing hasn't paused. They're investing billions into science, into education, into science infrastructure, what some have called a fitness club for scientific capacity. In contrast, in the US, we're seeing defunding of science, of attacks on universities, and otherwise. And so where is this all heading? Today, we're not questioning the legitimacy of US national security concerns. That is not the question here today, but it's actually what is the right balance that we want to strike between preserving US innovation and protecting it? Are we striking that right balance? So I have before me an absolutely star-cast panel here that I'm excited and feel privileged to moderate. So let me introduce you to them individually. So to my right is Lizzie Li, our Chinese fellow at CCA on economy. Dr. Lee is an economist turned journalist. She graduated from MIT from a PhD program in economics before joining New York-based independent Chinese media outlet Wall Street TV. She was also the host of The Signal Live with Lizzie Lee, powered by China Project. Next to her is Professor Susan Shirk, research professor at the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy and director emeritus of its 21st Century China Center. She's also director emeritus of the UC Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. And from 1997 to 2000, Susan served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs with responsibility for China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Mongolia. Next to her is Professor Yasheng Huang. He just joined us at CCA as a non-resident honorary senior fellow on economy and technology. Welcome, Yasheng. He also holds the EPEC Foundation Professorship of Global Economics and Management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Reflecting his many years of leadership at MIT, he served on the MIT China Strategy Group that authored a comprehensive report on how the university should engage with China in 2022. Currently, he serves on an advisory committee at MIT convened by the President's office on how MIT should respond to recent U.S. federal policies. His previous appointments include faculty positions at the University of Michigan and at the Harvard Business School. Brendan Kelly is also a non-resident fellow on Chinese economy and technology at the Center for China Analysis. He most recently served as Director for China Economics on the National Security Council staff at the White House from June 2023 to July 2024. He was instrumental in shepherding the scientific agreement between U.S. and China that got renewed in 2024 that we'll hear about more during our panel discussion. He was responsible for coordinating U.S. government economic policy issues, technology controls, and engagement related to China. And from 2018 to 2023, he served at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, including as acting head of international relations and country risk after leading the bank's analysis and engagement on Asia. So help me to welcome this panel members, and let us just dive in. So Lizzie, help set the stage. Can you help to kind of map out how we've gotten to where we are today in U.S.-China science collaboration? What were the turning points? What are some policy announcements that came out of Beijing that caused concern and then alarm in Washington, D.C.?
Well, thank you so much for the question. I'm going to start a decade ago. And you guys know I'm talking about Made in China 2025, which started in 2015 and now marked its decade anniversary. So we finally have a report card, and we're going to talk more about what that report card looks like in terms of China's ability to deliver successes versus the risks and challenges China still faces. But I think Made in China 2025, from the American national security policymaking circle's point of view, was a turning point. The most unsettling point about that plan was not the ambition itself, but the detailed roadmap it laid out on what China wants to achieve and how it plans to achieve it. So Made in China 2025 didn't really, it's not just about abstract goals, right? It went straight after strategic sectors that the U.S. led traditionally, those things like advanced computing, aerospace, right, biopharma. Suddenly the question becomes not, who makes our phones. It becomes whose values and technologies are embedded in the platforms of our future. And that was really concerning from the American policy making's point of view. And it's not just the ambition, the plan itself. It's also the asymmetric leverages China has in achieving those goals. I'm talking about industrial policy, state subsidy. And let's be clear, those tools are not bad, not inherently bad in and of themselves, right? Industrial policy plays an important role, and I would say the U.S. and Europe are slowly catching up to that, coming to that awareness that policy can actually make a difference in some sectors. Other tools are more murky and less clear, right? Industrial policy at that scale, few democracies could match, and also China has a host of regulatory tactics and tools that can really tilt the playing field in its favor. Roughly around the same time, European firms, American firms, were starting to observe and reporting more incidences of IP leakage, forced tech transfers, and also a patchwork of rules, regulations. Many of them are very opaque and, frankly, quite discriminatory in practice. So not just the goals, but also China's perceived asymmetric leverage. But I think what really shifted perceptions, as my colleague Brendan Kelly very helpfully reminded me, was this perception that China also has a whole of society approach when it comes to acquiring technology. The idea that is that, well, tech transfer doesn't come only from espionage alone. It also came through covert incentives that Beijing has access to, things like co-opting the research community, co-opting the diaspora community, right? Backdoor business deals, and how civilian researchers flow into military applications. So to many in Washington, it looked like state-orchestrated, systemic tech acquisition from U.S., and that was really concerning to many in the policymaking world. And the fear, I think, legitimate, is that U.S. research community, U.S. business community, were not well aware of those risks, the dangers. They were not well prepared, and they could be potentially exploited. To be fair, many of those concerns were valid, at least to some extent, and there were real evidence supporting some of the things I highlighted. But what happened afterward was, I would say, overreach, blurring the line of vigilance and, frankly, profiling. I'm talking about the China Initiative, and my colleagues and my fellow panelists are going to go deeper into that. Many targets of that initiative were Chinese Americans. They were investigated, as it turned out, not for espionage, but for, quite honestly, grant violations and, pretty minor grant violations in many cases. And also tax issues. Some are serious, some are quite minor. But careers, lives were derailed, were damaged. And the real personal stake, the real personal toll was immense. I have many stories to share. I won't share all of them on this stage, but they were painful to hear and painful to watch even from a distance. And the net benefit has been murky at best. We're going to talk more about those, how to strike that balance, what that actually means in today's policymaking world, which is still very much a live and dynamic discussion. But I will stop there and leave the stage to my stellar fellow panelists.
Thank you, Lizzie. So I think, Susan, one of the cornerstones of U.S. scientific enterprise has been its ability to attract world-class talent, to attract them to research with us, to collaborate with us, to educate and to learn from. And two pillars of our scientific enterprise is actually openness and academic freedom. So can you describe for us what have been some of the U.S. responses to what I think Lizzie has described? And also on top of that, I think there was sort of a national push for a civil-military fusion under President Xi Jinping. So what were some of those responses, and how has it affected our scientific research ecosystem in universities in particular?
Well, thanks so much. It's great to be here with all of you and talking about such a very, very important subject. My view is that Made in China 2025 was one very important driver of American policy response and law enforcement security response. But it was also the fact that China's own policies, more broadly described, became more repressive domestically in China and more assertive internationally. So if we hadn't had, the artificial island buildup in the South China Sea, and by the way, a number of these foreign policy actions start before Xi Jinping, and just become all the more assertive after Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012, 2013. So the notion that China is a threat, potentially a military threat to the United States and its allies, is really a very important part of the context here. And if China's own foreign policy were to moderate somewhat, I think over time, these threat perceptions might also be reduced. Although Americans really value primacy. And this, I think, frankly, it's kind of the wrong goal from my perspective. Everybody can't be number one in everything. And but in any case, I think threat perceptions more broadly were very important. But to go back to American reaction, the China initiative of the Department of Justice in 2018 is what, of course, people focus on. But at the same time, the largest federal funders of science, NIH, National Institute of Health, and the Department of Energy, were sending letters out to university administrators and starting investigations of recipients of federal research dollars who had had some collaboration, some time spent in China. And that led to a tremendous reaction, especially, now I'll just mention NIH. In the life sciences, Chinese and American scientists are the most active collaborators in the life sciences, and also the ones who publish in the highest quality journals. The way people evaluate what is the highest quality research is often by publication. And my colleagues at 21st Century China Center in the China Data Lab, Jia Ruixue and Molly Roberts, have a stream of research showing how successful and productive the collaborations in the life sciences were between Chinese and Americans. Of course, oftentimes including people from other countries as well. And what their research also shows is that after 2019, the introduction of these measures by NIH especially, and the China Initiative, these collaborations are reduced, and the productivity of American scientists who had worked together with Chinese colleagues also drops significantly, especially when you compare it to collaborations with scientists from other countries. So the impact was quick and it was significant. And so we can really see that kind of decoupling, I think we should call it, has already begun. They also found that in new research that they haven't published yet, it's just an unpublished paper, they did a survey experiment of policymakers and scientists and asked them if here's a research proposal, it's already been reviewed, high quality. This one, some of the respondents got one from Germany, some got from China, Chinese collaborations, and then they were asked should they go ahead with the research or not. And what was really depressing is that not just the policymakers who are thinking about risk, but the scientists themselves are saying, go ahead with the one from Germany, not with the one from China. So even in the chilling effect on scientists is still, has already really sunk in. Maybe I'll stop there.
So the China Initiative ended in 2022, and the effect of that seems very quick. I do know the paper that you mentioned by Jerry Shui and Molly Roberts, and the effect that they saw result on quality of publication because of that declining collaboration between US and China was quite significant, statistically significant, and so it was quite real. And so we have different strands here. We understand the overreaction of the China Initiative, sort of the racial bias and sort of the cost to U.S. Chinese scientists of Chinese heritage that Lizzie talked about, and also the security threat, the threat perception that we perceive from China. And so we have a very delicate balancing act to do here. But I want to turn to Yasheng now to ask you, what has been the impact of perception by Chinese scientists of U.S. science? And what do you think is the impact on global talent flow in STEM fields? Is this an irreparable damage? And we come to this question the day after the announcement by the US government that Harvard will no longer be able to enroll international students. And so how do you view this moment in history?
Well, very negatively. That's all I can say. The China Initiative started in 2018 in the Justice Department. Now there's a bill that was just passed by the Congress. It was terminated, as Jennifer pointed out, in 2022. But now there's a bill in the Congress to reinstate China Initiative as a legislative act. Before, it was a departmental project. Now there's an effort to make it a law of the land. Whether or not it's going to pass in the end, I don't really know, but at least there's the effort to revive a China Initiative. I think we need to think about this issue at several levels. One of the biggest contextual factor is what exactly is science and what exactly specifically is open science. I think this is a distinction that a lot of people don't quite get, even people who are extremely well educated. People tend to sort of think about the research produced by universities and research produced by companies in the same sort of a category of knowledge production. But in fact, they are fundamentally different from each other. The university research is open, is fundamental, and most of it is not applied. It is really about theories and fundamental ideas in knowledge production rather than the kind of knowledge that you can deploy immediately to for commercial purposes. This is a fundamental distinction, right? If it is open, then everybody has access to that knowledge. So this is where China Initiative, we have to understand China Initiative in that context. The China Initiative was motivated by the concern that the US government had and still has about Chinese effort to transfer IP to, in their words, steal knowledge from America, using university campuses as a vehicle to do that. But if we understand the nature of open science, that is just not a very productive way of thinking about this issue. I'm not going to say there are no spies, there are spies, but this is almost like stealing from New York Times, right? When you have that knowledge access very, very easily if you just subscribe to the magazines. And at universities, as many of you know, you can go to these seminars and nobody's going to check your ID. It is open, right? No North American university undertakes classified research, except, I might add, for MIT. But it is, but it's done at a separate location in Lexington, Massachusetts, rather than in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's under Lincoln Lab. And when Lizzie was a student there, I'm faculty at MIT. I cannot go there because to go there would require security clearance from the government, right? So universities don't undertake classified research. That being said, I think it is a legitimate question and legitimate debate to have, which is, whether or not in the current geopolitical environment, the open science still is a sort of predominant, first of all, equal principle. And we can have that debate. I think I will be much more happy if the policymakers and academics and others first have that debate rather than going after Chinese American scientists who have undertaken basic, fundamental, open scientific research. We can have that debate. We can also have a debate about precisely where the border is between fundamental research and applied research. Maybe in some areas the distinction has declined as compared with before. We can also have that debate. We can also have a debate and risk management of who we should collaborate with. I think these are all totally legitimate questions. What is not legitimate is for the government to go after scientists, many of them Chinese American, but not exclusively, for having undertaken open fundamental research collaborations with Chinese institutions. And let me also add that the China Initiative has gone after Chinese academics who undertook research collaborations 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when the official policy of the US government was to encourage collaborations with Chinese academic institutions. We can revise that as well, but it is fundamentally wrong to go after scientists who undertook collaborations and research projects under the previous policy regime that encouraged collaborations with Chinese institutions. Research funding agencies had called for proposals to collaborate with Chinese universities, and universities themselves encourage building the ties with Chinese scientists. And I agree with Susan, China has changed, and we need to recognize that reality. Maybe we shouldn't do this level of collaborations. Maybe we should be more selective in terms of our collaborative projects, but it is totally wrong for the US government to go after scientists who undertook these research projects under that environment. And a lot of these research collaborations have produced benefits, not just for China, not just for America, but for the global community as well, right? So what I feel really sad is that we don't have more of those discussions, and then we immediately jump into a criminalization approach, tactic. And as Lizzie pointed out, because in my spare time, I also work with an organization called Asian American Scholar Forum that is dedicated to open science, dedicated to defending the human rights and freedom of the speech of Asian American academics. And we all need your support. And I work with this organization after a colleague of mine at MIT, Gang Chen, was arrested by the FBI under the wire charge. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but later on I learned that federal government tends to use wire charge to go after gang members. And now they are using that wire fraud charge to go after academics. And now I'm terribly concerned that not only there is this effort to undermine the entire research community, but there's specific effort to target, again, Chinese American academics. And we all need to be aware of that. We all need to speak up about this development. And we also need to be aware how harmful and negative these activities have been to science, technology, and global human welfare.
Great, Yasheng. I think you put together such a comprehensive picture of the cost, also distinguishing between open basic science, fundamental science, versus applied science, and how they differ in the university context versus more commercial context, and the wrong-headed approach, if I might say, regarding the China initiative. But I want to turn to Brendan because in a way, I'm glad to land on you because you were at the White House and you also worked on sort of science policy, economic policy towards China, and you were instrumental in helping to renew the science and technology agreement with China. And so there is a ray of light here, and I want to understand sort of how the government views this collaboration between China and U.S. in science, and how that agreement has come to be, the scope, what remains, what's lost, and how we should think about that collaborative relationship.
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. It's great to join this distinguished panel, especially in this environment that my fellow panelists have discussed. There was a lot of pressure, particularly from some members of Congress, to let the U.S.-China Science and Technology Agreement, the STA, lapse or essentially cancel it. We thought that was misguided. I think this is a good example of an area where de-risking but not decoupling is the right approach to China. There are real national security risks. And so in amending the STA, we sought to set up clear guardrails around government-to-government cooperation, particularly anything that could support China's military modernization, but recognizing that we did not want to decouple scientifically, which would be essentially what I think we would have been signaling by canceling the agreement, and which would be damaging to U.S. interests. I think there are similarities to the broader economic relationship. So a couple of weeks ago, from the U.S.-China meeting in Geneva, the Trump administration said that broader decoupling economically is not in the U.S. interest. That would be damaging. So sort of pull back from prohibitive tariff levels. Similarly, in this case, decoupling scientifically, at a minimum, would take away a lot of U.S. visibility on a lot of the leading science going on in China, damaging our own competitiveness. So in terms of the actual SCA text, it was the first major revision or rewrite since the original agreement in 1979. So it did need to be updated to better reflect sort of the new nature of the U.S.-China relationship. First, we were clear that the STA in collaboration is focused on basic science, the fundamental science that Yasheng mentioned, and that would not include collaboration on critical and emerging technologies. These are sort of the more of applied technologies. These are some of the sectors in Made in China 2025 that Lizzie mentioned. The Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House keeps a public list of these. But basically a concern that those could pose elevated risks to U.S. national security, advancing a potential strategic competitor in those areas. Second, entering the renegotiation, the key concerns that we heard from researchers was around data sharing and integrity, particularly in China's increasingly restrictive information environment, as well as restrictions on cross-border data sharing. So we had a lot of focus on that throughout the negotiations. In the document, adding an annex on data management, access, and reciprocity, trying to ensure that U.S. researchers would gain timely and complete access to any data, as well as, from an open science standpoint, publishing those, as Yasheng mentioned. And then lastly, we were careful to emphasize both publicly and privately that the STA only applies to government cooperation. And importantly, any protections that we negotiate, aren't legally protecting non-government researchers. That said, I think it was clear during the process in our external engagement that the impact of the STA in either amending that or canceling that carries significant symbolic and even tangible value more broadly. One scientist described the STA to me as a normative umbrella that benefits researchers in the U.S. and China broadly in the academic world. So as an example, for the guidelines we negotiated on data sharing, U.S. researchers can point to these, and Chinese researchers also, when they're facing obstacles in their Chinese system to data sharing. And lastly, as part of this process, we strengthened sort of an internal risk-benefit review that any collaboration would have to go through, looking at national security risks before proceeding. Where does this take us going forward? I think officials and other experts and others in D.C., I think are clear-eyed regarding a fairly broad-based military-civil fusion efforts of the Chinese system to leverage civilian, commercial, and academic research for military and defense purposes. So this naturally circumscribes the scope for cooperation, and it also requires, right security measures in place to address that. One area that I think there's been a lot of work on, and there was in the government in the last 4 years, is on strengthening research security programs at academic and even private labs. So that's maybe a more balanced and sustainable approach to addressing those national security risks while maintaining our commitment to open science. And maybe just in closing, one of my biggest concerns is, I think we heard it mentioned, the life sciences, is extending and broadening the technology controls by both sides to the areas of biotech and life sciences. We've seen a little bit of that, so far that we haven't seen what we've seen in sort of semiconductors, advanced computing, but that type of development I think would be very damaging for health research and health outcomes on both sides, where we do increase restrictions in that area.
Great, thank you, Brendan. Yeah, so from the government's perspective, it's nice to have that. So Lizzie, I want to come back to you. So you touched on this a bit, but can you tell us, where is China leading in terms of global innovation? Yeah.
Great question. And, I mentioned this report card from Made in China 2025. So let's look at the report card and see how China is doing currently. I think, ironically, Made in China 2025, 10 years on, reviews as much about China's limits as it does about its achievement and strength. So let me just walk through some of the key takeaways I observe from the report card I mentioned. Well, China has certainly made real progress, impressive progress in many fields. In electric vehicles, in batteries, in industrial robotics. And China's not just catching up, it's leading, and in many cases setting global standards for best practice. If we take firms like CATL, BYD, they are globally competitive and they are setting sort of what the best firms in this field can achieve. For a lot of the Western companies that used to be their, the leading companies, their sort of leading counterparts. And let's talk about advanced manufacturing. I think here is a area where state policy actually delivered. So state policy delivers where private capital hesitates for good reasons. These are long-term, low-margin, infrastructure-heavy, front-loaded sectors where private investors have reason to hesitate and stay away from. And state policy, state subsidies really work here. And let's look at what China did really well. I think China showed how excellent it is at adaptation and localization. So if we think about the technologies behind lithium batteries, the technologies behind AI, right, technologies behind automation, those were not moonshot inventions by Chinese scientists and Chinese engineers. But China was able to leverage that technology, localize it, deploy it at scale, fast, in a very cost-effective way, and deliver transformative effect on its industrial ecosystem, on its economy. And I think that's really humbling. Here in the US, we tend to equate innovation as invention. this idea is, really great, innovation is worthy of a Nobel Prize. But I think China shows us that we need to rethink about the definition of innovation itself. Sometimes innovation just looks like relentless iteration, right? Brutal competition, system-level integration and execution at scale. And China showed how well it can be done and how transformative innovation can deliver in changing the landscape of its economy. And another part of China's strength showed by Made in China 2025's success is that I think Chinese engineers and scientists are genius in developing workarounds. They are genius in working under constraints. And they are genius in delivering under tight time constraints. Again, I'm talking about in a judgment-neutral way, right? So take Huawei. Huawei had hard time getting access to cutting-edge chips. What Huawei came up with was this chiplet technology. In layman's term, basically by stacking multiple low-performance chips together to deliver the same level of compute as advanced chips. Well, it's not the most elegant solution. It's kind of an engineering workaround, but it works. And it keeps the machine of Huawei going, buys it time. So Huawei can actually use the time to come up with real innovation. And it works. That's the kind of innovation China's really good at. But I think, we also need to be clear-eyed about what the Chinese system is still not quite achieving. If you look at Made in China 2025, a lot of it is very investment heavy. If we talk about return on investment, that's a whole different story. So to me, I think what we see is an innovation system that's still not quite organic. It's still quite not self-sustaining. I'm not quite sure if that innovation system is standing on its own, in the absence of policy support. And I think we need to be very clear about that. China still has a gap to fill there. Well, in many fields, it's catching up, but it's still not quite there. So that's one thing. And another core challenge I see through, this report card from Made in China 2025 is incentive. A lot of the incentives built in Made in China 2025 is still output metric driven, right? Reward driven. And when you have incentives, sometimes you see distorted incentives. The classic principal agent problem, if you guys took Econ 101 in college. If you look at patents, right? Patent volume is high from China, but many of them are patent fillers, right? Low quality utility models, not actual valuable patents. That's how incentives might work in different, in distorted ways. And when that incentive interacts with China's political economy, what you see is incentives get distorted at the local level, right? China's local governments have various degrees of policy discipline. Some local governments basically just, chase after subsidies, go after shiny project, creating this innovation theater, right? Here we're talking about wasteful projects. Every firm had a semiconductor in its name, but, they were actually just making shoes or something like that, right? And that's how incentives actually get distorted. What you saw was the corruption scandals and, kind of waste of resources and kind of this, how state policy itself is not real substitution for real incentive to innate incentive to innovate. And I think that's also a lesson that we should be clear. And let me just talk about semiconductor. It's a little bit of a, uneven landscape here. And let's see what China did and what it did not do, right? In terms of breakthrough, we see impressive breakthrough in memory chips. China's, memory chip development has been quite impressive, in many ways catching up to the global frontier. But if we're looking at logic chips, which is much more sophisticated and complicated in terms of technology, China still depends heavily on imports. So what's the difference? I think when it comes to something that's really complicated, really sophisticated, you actually require more than innovation speed, innovation scale. You actually need innovation depth. And China's domestic innovation system is still not quite mature yet to catch up on that front. That takes a deeper reservoir of talents, of kind of vibrant capital market, of decades of research, as a solid base to deliver. And China's still not quite there yet. Well, it's catching up. but it's not something that policy alone can accelerate. So, so what's a final take on it? So I think the U.S. has legitimate reason to be concerned about another DeepSeek moment. But I think from, decade in, when we look at Made in China 2025, we see China's ability to deliver under compressed timeline. We see where industrial policies can really make a difference. But it's also revealing how much of the system is still dependent on policy, on this interaction between this industrial ecosystem and its policy, and where the system really hits its limit. So I think we need a more well-rounded view on where China is moving fast and where China is still lagging behind.
Great. There was a really comprehensive picture of where China is strong and where there are still sort of weaknesses in its innovation ecosystem and science ecosystem. So, Susan, let me turn to you. So, is there...
I want to mention that many Chinese scientists and science policy people say exactly the same thing about their own system. So, this is not just the foreigner perspective. There's been, quite a lot of internal criticism and drive for reform too.
Absolutely right. So we have a very good snapshot and analysis of China's science and technology innovation, as Susan just mentioned.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
you.
go ahead. Not at all. Please feel free to interact and comment on each other's comments. So I wanted to come back to you because we see that there are strengths to sort of state-led innovation, but also sort of weaknesses of that, maybe not an organic ecosystem. What are your thoughts in terms of disengagement then when science collaboration with China? And I'd like to actually turn our attention more to maybe what the U.S. is doing in the context of this U.S.-China science, if there's disengagement, but also competition in that context, what that means for universities.
Well, maybe I can speak to what I think is the sort of current state of the discussion inside the United States about tech restrictions more broadly, including talent, which is such a critical ingredient. And of course, it's really worth repeating the very important fact that American research universities, American higher education, is one of America's greatest strengths. It is the magnet that attracts talent from all over the world. We now have a global knowledge economy, and there are talented people all over the world. I mean, you look at the numbers of international students at Harvard, for example, which are reported today because of what the Trump administration has done there. So it's, the talent factor is so important because our universities attract people from all over the world, and then typically, like over 70% of those people, including and especially Chinese, opt to remain in the United States and become scientists, entrepreneurs, or they go back. If they go back to China, then they become collaborators with their advisor or their colleagues here in the United States or in other parts of the world. And so these restrictions, especially on talent, I'll concentrate on that, I think have really been costly because we do see fewer Chinese parents wanting to send their kids to American universities, graduate students coming here. And I don't think that many will go back to China because living in the Chinese system after you've lived outside the Chinese system is really difficult, I think, because even if you get a lot of research funding, there are other limitations on your, obviously, access to information, Great Firewall, barriers, and freedom of speech, and so many other challenges living in China as an intellectual. It's very, very difficult. But they can go to Canada, it's not very far away, or the UK. We see, and the cuts in science spending, federal science dollars, really makes the attractiveness of remaining in the United States also diminished. So, I think there are many counterproductive features of American restrictions. I also feel that our restrictions on, for example, the Huawei chips, this sort of extraterritorial effort to tell other countries you mustn't buy Huawei chips, use Huawei chips now. And it's fascinating to me that the Chinese side now, responded very quickly with their own retaliation or threatened retaliation. So, it's not going to be cost-free and to the United States or for our friends and allies. So I do see right now, especially with Donald Trump as president, despite all the things that we might disagree with that the Trump administration is doing, it does open up a little bit more space for debating the tech restrictions in a rational manner. I see the people, there's a kind of camp of people, and I count myself among them, who think that a lot of the tech restrictions from the United States, beginning with the first Trump administration and then through Biden and now in the second Trump administration, are what Paul Triolo has called small gain, high cost. And I think that's, of course, a riff on the small yard, high fence idea. So that, we've gone to tremendous effort to implement these restrictions, but what have we really gained from it? And as Yasheng was saying, this is really a time that we should be debating those issues. What are the benefits and what are the costs of these policies?
So let me pass it on to you, Yasheng, from that conversation, both in terms of attracting world-class talent to the U.S., which has really been the engine for science innovation, but also the tech restrictions that U.S. federal policy today and just in recent years. Your thoughts on that?
So I don't want to repeat what Susan said. I agree with her 100% on talent and tech restrictions. But I want to put this issue on a sort of in a broader context. If you remember, there was a Sputnik moment in this country after Soviet Union launched satellite into the space. Scientific funding and the effort by the federal government to support education of scientific topics increased dramatically. If you look at the federal spending on research and development as a share of the budget, as a share of the GDP, increased dramatically. Also, the Vietnam War also helped push that ratio up. Now we have a DeepSeek moment and maybe China 2025 moment, and yet we went in the exactly opposite direction. We're cutting the federal funding on research and development. We're going after universities. We're restricting international human capital flows into our own country. we're going out and arresting Chinese American scientists, put them on phantom charges such as wire fraud. I mean, does anybody rationally think this is the right way to respond to that moment? So with all the national security challenges that we're facing from China, from Russia, and from others, I do believe that a national comprehensive strategy is in order, right? We need to invest more in science and technology. We need to have a version of industrial policy to solve the problem that Lizzie described, which is how to commercialize and scale intellectual assets coming out of research organizations into production, into commercialization. That's actually incredibly difficult. It's not that easy. And I agree with Lizzie that there is this lazy view in America that all we do is to celebrate inventions rather than scaling and the production. But the economic benefits are in the production and the commercialization of ideas rather than simply in inventions of new ideas, right? So, but look at what the Trump administration is doing. They are setting back the CHIPS Act. They are cutting down industrial policy programs. So we are hurting ourselves both on the upstream side, which is the production of science and fundamental research, and then we're also hurting ourselves on the downstream side in terms of the efforts put out by the Biden administration to scale the knowledge and technology into commercialization, into production. This is the moment we are talking about. And I think historians in the future are not going to be very kind when they look at this moment and reevaluate this rise and fall of the great powers. This is not the only moment, but this will be one of the moments where the balance of power has been decided.
Okay, so on a Friday before a long weekend, Brendan, if you could, just wanted to see where you might see, are there any positive notes from the extension of the agreement or whatnot in terms of collaboration between U.S. and China, the production of global goods? Yeah.
No, I think there's definitely scope and a necessity for some of that collaboration to continue. I mean, so in basic science areas such as earthquake data, influenza data support our vaccine development, timely and accurate air quality data, many others where having access to Chinese data and collaboration with Chinese scientists is beneficial to us. Coming back to the biomedical area, there's tremendous scope there, and again, a concern if we close off on both sides. So one prominent area is cancer research that I appreciate some of the Asia Society team and leadership has done a lot of work on in the cure for cancer. That there's been some efforts to try to bring China on side with this. But between the U.S. and China, I think we have 40% of global cancer patients. The access to the information on that data pool, ability to harmonize or accelerate clinical trials between the two largest economies, but the two largest, essentially sources of those patient populations and data could provide real benefits and save, by some estimates, hundreds of thousands or millions of lives over time. So I think some people on both sides, do appreciate that. I'm optimistic there can be continued discussions to try to keep in place cooperation in some of those areas where it's of mutual benefit.
If you would be willing to stay and ask some questions, I think that would be fine. Okay. Okay. Oh, sure.
You want to be the first victim?
It doesn't take me long to come up with a question. I'm known for that. Hi, David Zweig, friend of many of the people on the panel and researcher on human talent. One thing that, and I noticed this once when I heard Yasheng speak, I think you have to go back a bit further, and I think you have to go back to 9/11. And I think you have to go to the national security laws that came out of that. And since that date, the National Security Agency collects 1.8 billion emails a month coming in from overseas. And it then passes any names. I mean, that's how Xiaoxing Temple was discovered. They found, the National Security Agency found that there was a reference to some kind of technology. They then passed his name on to the FBI. The FBI misread the technology and then kicked his door in, right? And my understanding is that the reason that the cross-border, cross-Pacific collaboration has dried up is because of that problem, which is if you're sitting in China and you have a student who is your student working in the United States, you know that if you do collaboration with him in any kind of field of technology, he is potentially going to be investigated by the FBI. And I think that's, when you want to go back to a problem, that's sort of the source of the problem. And so what in fact we've seen is that Chinese researchers in the US, I've collected NIH data, and the NIH data show that Chinese scholars, such as yourself, in the United States won't collaborate with Chinese scholars across the Pacific, but their new co-Is or their co-PIs are Chinese scholars in the United States. And so there has been an adjustment. If you look at the NIH data, which I did, that the adjustment is that the cross-Pacific collaboration has dried up completely. The China Initiative has been remarkably successful. But part of the reason it's successful is people on both sides are scared. And they're scared that any kind of collaboration is going to trigger. So I just would, call on you, Yasheng. I mean, I respect you greatly, but I would, in your organization needs to focus even more, I think, on Section 702 under the law, the security, I'm sorry? It's similar to the Patriot Act, but it's Section 702. And Section 702 just got repassed by, even under the Biden administration. So I would put that out there. If it wasn't a comment, a question, I'm sorry.
We'll just take one more question after that.
Thank you. Very nice. And I always love hearing you, Brendan. Noah Lehrman from the Minor Metals Trade Association. You've touched a little on some of the negative impacts of Chinese responses to some of U.S. policy, and even a little bit, I think, on critical minerals, technology, and export restrictions. I think you've also touched on some of the potential for the Geneva negotiations to create some openings. Do you think the subsequent trade negotiations do present an opportunity to have some more constructive dialogue and progress on these issues?
Is it a question for Lizzie or for?
For whoever wants to answer.
Well, yes. I think I'm watching to see what the follow-up is. And I was encouraged that the USTR, Jameson Greer, apparently met Li Changgang, the Chinese trade negotiator, at the margins of the APEC trade ministers meeting in Seoul. And I hope they are developing a game plan for follow-up negotiations, perhaps at the working level, and then move up. And it could be nudged along by a phone call between Xi Jinping and President Trump. But, I mean, they wouldn't be negotiating anything, believe me. But it would say, well, this is good, we're moving in the right direction, whatever. And then, but on the tech side, I think the tech issues are still looming out there. And nobody really is clear about what the Trump administration's approach will be. But I can predict that the Chinese side is not going to deliver the earlier purchase commitments from the first Trump administration trade deal, which probably the U.S. side will demand, or even more purchases and other concessions from China without having its own asks. And I expect that its own asks will focus quite a lot on the tech restrictions.
So I want to respond to David's observation and question. I think definitely there's a fear factor after the China initiative and the research output drop that colleagues of Susan have documented is the other side of that equation. The Asian American Scholar Forum has conducted survey research on this topic, and really just incredibly high percentage of the Chinese American academics feel that the fear factor, right? So, and even on the part of the young graduate students who didn't have any history of collaborations with China, even they feel this fear factor. I think, David, you brought up another very important point. We do criticize China initiative, which was 2018, but this thing goes way back. When Ho Li in the 1980s was prosecuted, and Xi Xiaoxing, that was 2015, that was under the Obama administration. So there was a long history of going after Chinese American scientists and technologists, and the China initiative scaled that prosecution effort, right? So that's the difference between the China initiative and the previous activities. Another thing I want to add is that David also brought up the point about 9/11. That's true. I agree with you in terms of the privacy, in terms of monitoring of the telecommunications. But it is also true that President George W. Bush reaffirmed a document, what is known as NSDD 89. I may not get all the abbreviation right, but something to that effect, and which was a 1984 national security document under the President Ronald Reagan to make a sharp distinction between fundamental and open research and classified research. And they identify this middle area, the sensitive technology, then that area of technology should be subject to export control. After 9/11, at that time, the concern was not about China, but it was really more about Middle East. That distinction was reaffirmed in the strongest possible terms by National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice and by President George W. Bush. Right? So even in that environment, after 9/11, there was a recognition of the importance and the spirit of open science and fundamental science, the kind of recognition that is completely lacking today. And this is really, really worrisome.
Great. I think we will wrap it up there, but Yashun, you summarized very well sort of the confusion and sort of the blurry line between open fundamental research and what's applied research and what the Chinese scientists are going through today in the US. So thank you very much for staying with us until the very end on this very important conversation.